Um, okay, so time is 5:01. We've got a quorum. We we're missing our secretary tonight in Susan Franklin. Is there anyone that'd be willing to take minutes, recognizing the only minutes are going to be to document the fact that we're going into executive session?
Yeah, I can do that. I generally take meeting notes and
Okay.
continue to do that. It's
Okay.
fine.
And with that, I'd like to entertain a motion to move into executive session to discuss matters with related to the acquisition of real estate. Actually, just bear with me a second. Is there something ahead of that on the agenda tonight?
I thought there was. I think it was fields and updates on
We
other things. Correct.
I think there
yeah,
are
we
actually.
put for the first hour the three major projects that we knew about. Fields and courts, the school maintenance and upgrades, and roads and sidewalks.
Okay.
I can't swear to that particular order. I'm trying to get this.
I got it. Yeah, it's fields and courts, roads and sidewalk, schools, and then 610 for our executive, roughly.
Yep.
Okay. Apologies. I'm having a bit of a groggy day here. Um, okay. Well, first of all, let's start with a roll call attendance. Corey Evans.
Ravens here.
Great. Ralph Dormitzer.
Dormitzer here.
Michael Dick.
Mike Dick here.
Brian Host here. Francine Lyons. Not present. And Susan Franklin, also not present. Okay. So we're underway. I believe the goal this evening is really to assemble a list of questions that we can present to the various parties that are working on these requests. We don't have formal requests in front of us at this moment. They are at this point in the public dialogue as projects that are coming along. In the case of Fields and Courts, there's actually been a presentation on these matters to the public. And they're going to be coming to Capitol hopefully very soon, as soon as the entire package becomes public. But in the meantime, at Michael's suggestion, which I think was prudent, there was I think a feeling that we should, at least as a team, start to anticipate what's coming at us and start to prepare our thoughts and our questions so that we can feed those into the folks that are going to be presenting to us, so that we're not taking multiple bites at the apple. So that's the background as I perceive it. I'm curious if there are others that feel differently in terms of what we'd like to achieve in today's meeting, but I'll pause there.
I think you've got that right. That's all what we would like to do tonight.
Okay. So I think this meeting is going to look and feel a little different than our typical capital budget meeting, where we have a presentation and we sit and ask questions of the party that's actually seeking an approval on a request. We have neither requests nor are we going to be providing approvals tonight. It's really just to start to get ahead of this. So why don't we start with first item on the agenda, which is Fields and Courts. How would people like to start?
Why don't we do this? Would you, as our chair and as our moderator, just announce the project, the amount of money that we think is coming, the amount of money that we think will be requested, and then I would turn it over. I see Chris just joined us. Hi, Chris.
Okay.
Turn it over to Chris and Michelle to give us maybe a 1 or 2 minute overview, just to remind us of what we're up against, and then just to open it up for discussion.
Okay.
Does that sound good to everybody?
It certainly sounds good to me. I don't think we've asked Chris and Michelle to prepare anything, but I certainly think they understand these projects and can hopefully fill in the blanks a little bit. But just in terms of the highlights here, one of the items that we anticipate at special town meeting will be an article for fields. So these are two playing fields courts, which are the tennis courts, which will also include the ability to have them be convertible to and from pickleball. At least some of them, not all of them. But it'll give us that flexibility to start to introduce that sport. To the extent it takes off, more courts can be converted or added in the future. There's also a replacement of the Beechwood playground. And there's also the addition of a new lacrosse wall to accommodate that sport. The total amount that right now is being contemplated is $4 million in total. It's anticipated right now that that would primarily go to CPC, but that has not yet been before them, and there's no sort of funding commitment on their part. So one of the questions we'll need to address is, in the event that they're unwilling to fund it, how do we feel about this in the context of a tax increase, which is the alternative that's available for contemplation. So I'll pause there, turn it over to Chris and Michelle just to give a bit more of a summary on this, and then we can open it up to questions.
Okay, I'm wearing both hats tonight. Michelle is heading off to CPC tonight, actually, to present this same topic to them. So there was a public meeting back on the 2nd of August. You can watch the video if you'd like. It should be on the website. I can get you links if you want. And there's a PowerPoint that went along with it, which I can most certainly get to share with all of you, which has pretty much the summary of all of the pieces to it. And as Brian said, it involves the rehabilitation of the tennis courts, make it 6 courts, and the rehabilitation of the retaining wall. That's actually the single biggest expense in the whole thing, simply because there's a retaining wall that has to be rebuilt, and the tennis courts have to be improved for the long term. Then there's work at Deer Hill, which would make that a lighted field. Michelle's just giving me the fields and courts hot off the presses print. So I can send this all to you folks anyway. So yeah, could you email it? All right, Michelle's going to email you the PowerPoint, so you have it all tonight if you wanted to start chewing on it more. The tennis courts are about $1.5 million, and it's designed to include lighting in the future, but not now. So it's kind of be set up to put lights in, but there won't be lighting added to that at this time. There's the multi-purpose field over at Deer Hill. Like I said, it'll be natural grass, but it'll be turned into a full-size multi-purpose field, and the softball diamond, which is kind of at one corner, will be rehabilitated as well. And this will have lighting, so this will be able to be played in the evenings and and nights in the spring and fall. I guess even in the summer, but I don't think there's a whole lot of night games in the summertime. And that's lacrosse, soccer, field hockey, and softball, so it covers 4 sports. It's $1.8 million for that segment of it. The other 2 pieces are comparatively small. One is a sports wall, and that's you bounce balls off it. It's lacrosse. It can be used by tennis and a bunch of other sports, soccer apparently as well. So and that's about $100,000 all in, and that includes turf that goes around it too, because the kids are going to be on bouncing balls or hitting balls. It doesn't wear down. And then the full replacement of the Beechwood playground. It's about $350,000. That brings us into ADA compliance and also makes the equipment all modern. And we're going to be getting a small contribution from Rec for that at this point of $14,000, and perhaps more coming in from other locations. So those are the 4 components: tennis, Deer Hill, the sports wall, and the playground. And again, roughly, when you add it all up, it's about $4 million. The plan is to go out to bid this fall, and then so we'll have actual locked pricing for town meeting. And there's also, as I said before, Michelle's going to CPC, and not to apply tonight because this is just to kind of highlight. And then there'll be a formal application for them, I believe, next week. And we're probably going to ask for all of it, quite frankly. But if they don't give all of it, we'd like them to give as much as possible, because it's a 100% CPC fundable project. So, so it's definitely it's right. It's about as CPC oriented as you can get, I think, from a fields and courts point of view. So if I can try to answer any questions anybody has.
Chris, I'm just trying to put numbers next to things. Is Beechwood Playground? So I added up to 1,518 and another 100. which gets me to 3.4. Is Beechwood Playground 600?
No, it's about 350. But then remember, we still have to get bid documents on some of these things. I mean, like the playground's pretty easy, but the fields, there has to be, that lighting design still has to be done. You have to put the conduits in. You have to, and again with the with the retaining wall, there's got to be some engineering drawings prepared to ensure that's done, to standards, so it lasts.
So those things are not in the numbers above the 1518.
I don't believe so.
They're on the last slide, slide 7 of the presentation. Yeah, the $250,000 for engineering.
Yeah.
Chris, I know the lacrosse wall's been moving around a bunch. I didn't see in this. Where is that going to go?
Sawyer Street, at the rec center.
Thanks.
Just to get the breakdown again, and I'm typing here rather than looking at the presentation. I have 1.5 for the tennis courts. I did the math and I came up with 1.8 for the lighted field at Deer Hill. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and then
100 for the sports wall. It's about 100 for the sports wall.
Yep. So that comes out to 4 million. Then we add 250 for design and engineering.
No, it's again, if the math is being done right, and I could be giving you things.
The math works. Yeah. So it's 1.5 for the tennis courts, 100 for the sports wall, 1.8 for the multi-purpose field at Deer Hill, 350 for Beechwood, and then 250 for engineering, and you get to 4.
Got it. Thank you.
And the goal is to have to have that hard with bids that would be held through town meeting, and then
that's an all-in number. There'll be no.
Yes, that's everything. Yeah. Okay. And there is, I said there's 14 from the rec revolving fund for the Beechwood playground, but I think I'm almost certain there's some money potentially coming for the sports wall from some of the boosters clubs, though I don't have a set number on that. I know there's been asks, from lacrosse and soccer and others to put some money in, and there might be a contribution from the Beechwood community for the playground. I just don't have a number on that yet.
Mm-hmm.
And all that would come off, right? Obviously, anything that would go right into the project and come off the top.
Is my screen flickering? Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah.
I might have a funky light here. I'm sorry.
There's also thundering. My dog just ran away, so we have a thunderstorm moving through the air. So if I disappear, it's because something hit town hall.
Yeah.
Chris, my apologies. I spoke over somebody.
No, I hated the silence, so I thought, okay.
No. Well, so I don't want to be playing telephone between two meetings here, but I am curious because I know that CPC, I've seen their bullet point pop up in multiple places. So it seems to me that there may be a possibility that CPC has to slice this stick of butter pretty thin if all the requests are going for them in the different lanes they have. Any sensation of what to expect from their priorities? I know they really haven't met much, but apropos to what Brian said earlier about what if this CPC can't fund the whole thing, what happens then? Just try to feel out what to expect.
So I we're gonna have a better feel for that, I think, after tonight, because their meeting's tonight at 7, I think.
Okay.
So I'll have a little bit better vibe from that. You can watch it after this is over. You can go watch that one if you want. That's gonna be online too. I believe the estimate is that we're talking about CPC last 2 years generated about $800,000. The conservative estimate for this year is only about $650,000, but I think that's very low because we're generating already at the town level just from the surcharge over $6 million. And the state match, well, it's not where it used to be. It's not 100% anymore. It's still fairly robust. And the last year was over $200,000. even if you go with 6, that's $6 million over 10 years, plus the money they already have in the bank, right? So, and this could be funded over time. And there's also some money they have. Again, I don't know how much they have in the bank right now. Arguably, this is this project in particular is the biggest recreational project that's ever been presented to, or that's been presented to them, at least in current times. I don't know what's been presented in the past. And it's a big overhaul, right? I mean, it's tennis is a big deal. A lot of kids play, a lot of adults play. It's a big deal. The Deer Hill field is actually to have a big full multi-purpose field. Another one that has lights is really a big deal, particularly even on school property. The Beechwood Playground is something that's definitely needed. And the sports wall, while it's small in a sense of dollars, has a much bigger impact. At least that's what I'm told by people who use the things. So it kind of covers a lot of bases. So it definitely it's one of the things that CPC was set up for, right? Is to fund these kinds of things. So I'm not going to project what they're going to do, other than the select board did appoint. There's a whole lot of new members on that this year. And while no one's made a commitment to do anything other than be open, and again, Jennifer Mullins on that meeting tonight too. I think that the ask is going to be high, and once we know what it comes back at, we can then figure out where to go. I mean, I think it would be. I think there should be an expectation, though, that some element will be left by the CPC would not fund 100% of it. I'm hoping they'll fund a fairly large percentage of it. So I do think there's going to be some remainder amount. I don't know what that will be, but I do think there'll be some. I think it's fair to estimate there'll be some remainder amount.
Okay.
I'd like to talk more in general terms about each of the items and how badly we need them. Now, Chris, we certainly understand that the proponents feel that they really are essential, but I've had a chance to go and look at these different sites, and I feel that some of our facilities are okay and can continue to be used without these large upgrades. The one area that I feel that a good case has been made, and I can't personally, I'm not saying anyone other than me, but I personally feel that this is a good spend, is on the tennis courts and the flexibility to add, the pickleball. Where I have a hard time, folks, is on the Deer Hill School upgrade. The reason I say that is it is in constant use, but I don't know if it requires an upgrade for $1.8 million. I also feel that the sports wall is a nice to have, but not an essential. And then the Beechwood Playground, which I've actually used with my grandson, to me is very useful. We put $30,000 to repair, and they have made the repairs, and they've added they've added more wood chips to the surface. Now, the wood chip surface, I will say as an aside, is not ADA compliant. But we're also not under the gun at the moment for ADA compliance. We're not in violation. So those are just some of my thoughts.
So I'm sorry if I just can interrupt for just a second. We actually are in ADA. We are in non-compliance.
Okay, I stand corrected. Thank you.
So actually, I represented the town at a hearing, and we asked for a time to come into compliance. So we are going to. We've applied for an ADA grant to fund an interim or permanent solution, depending on what ends up happening with this project at Beechwood. Good. And do the same thing at the playgrounds behind the library, and that would be a rubber mat surface that you could lay down and make the connection ways, as opposed to a port. If Beechwood Playground is reconstructed entirely, we'd have a port in place, not the whole thing, but port in place paths that would be there where they needed to be. So we are not in compliance. We've been given a waiver to come into compliance. We're actually, and so we do have to come into compliance. So. So we're going to have to spend money on the playground, Mike, to get into AD compliance, even if we don't renovate the entire thing. So, okay. And that would be an ask by
our questions. I would add a question that is, can we, just based on what you just said, Chris, and I really appreciate it, can we put money in for the surface and go with the equipment that we already have, which seems to have quite a bit of useful life left in it. There's also one other suggestion I would have where I would support spending additional money at the Beechwood Playground, and that would be a canopy. There is no shelter from the sun, and we were out there in May, not too bad. And then we were there again this last July, and it was brutal. We didn't stay very long just because the sun was so hot. So that would be something I would bring to the rec department as part of their plans. So the question I would have, and I'm not looking to start a debate tonight of, you know, making a statement and hearing a counter proposal and so on. I just want to develop a set of questions. So the question would be, do we really need the new equipment? What will it take to get us into ADA compliance fully? And is a canopy a better idea at this time than perhaps new equipment? And there may be a philosophy on canopies. Maybe there's a reason there are not canopies around, but I'm just coming at it from a lay person and someone who's actually used it with an 18-month-old child.
Mike, when you say a canopy, what is it that you're envisioning? Are you saying a canopy on the play structure itself, or a canopy over some portion of the play area to create, you know, a shaded spot on the ground?
What I'm thinking of is a very large canopy that would cover the major structures, which would be a big structure. I don't know. I'm not a designer. I'm not an architect. You know, maybe you put a canopy over, you know, there are 3 different areas there, and maybe there would be 3 separate canopies. The idea is, what's the best way to create some shade there so that there can be more use? Mike, so there's a question. There's a question that I would add. And again, I apologize for my camera.
You're fine.
Well, I'm taking notes, but is someone taking notes to send to Michelle and I so we can?
I'm having just said all that, I'm trying to type it up right now.
Okay, all right. So I'll because that is, I mean, I'm taking notes too, but it's going to be helpful to have. I'd rather have 2 sets of them than one.
It's funny, Mike. I mean, I wonder if even you could just add some those strips to that fence, because since the field is to the south, the sun is really coming in from the south. If you had a canopy over it, you really actually wouldn't get any shade because the sun would come through. So really what you need is almost like a hedgerow, or even just some of the things between that fence, just to kind of cut that glare. You'd probably shade that whole place just by adding a little bit of opaqueness to that chain link fence there.
I'm just going to say, can we add shade in some form? And do we need to replace a usable structure, play equipment, and support an ADA compliant surface? Any other thoughts, questions that I can add to this list on this?
A couple of thoughts anyway, Mike, from me. One is that the obvious answer is a tree. Okay, that you put a tree in the south, and most people actually use shade of trees. If it's possible, that's where I'd go with that one. That's a pretty easy way to do things. You would probably have to go on the south side in some way, but nevertheless, that's probably a useful way to do it, and relatively inexpensive, but long life. It takes a long time before they're useful. The other question I'll raise, and this is for Chris, is that I was involved in the discussions when the wood chips were the ADA compliant solution, and that was a change from a previous ADA compliant solution, and now we're into the third ADA compliant solution, which of course will fail because there'll be a fourth ADA compliant solution. I mean, the whole thing is getting to be a point of ridiculousness, as you have probably experienced yourself. Anyway, I'm not denying that we should do it. I'm just saying that this is getting absurd when you go through two episodes of ADA compliance, and now you're into the third. And it's only a matter of a new regulatory agency will come in and offer you up a new solution, because the current new solution is not going to work out, because the kids will get their shins burned on the rubber. I mean, things like that are going to happen. So this is all amazing how many of these things are rejected because there's a flaw in the design somewhere. But anyway, sorry for the epistle on this one, but it's my experience on this.
I'm shifting hats here, so my apologies, everybody. I'm finding this shift a little bit clunkier than just kind of understanding exactly what I should think about. So I'm not, I think of this partially if we're going to the public and the public is going to fund this. I think you could argue that none of these are needs, right? They're all wants. Recreation is by default a want, right? And I think the question is, are the people willing to pay for a playground for kids, or tennis courts for the tennis team? And I'm not really too concerned about it. I don't want to say I'm not concerned about the money, because I am, but the policy decision about whether we move forward or not, I think is a recreation decision that the public needs to make kind of for itself. I'm not too concerned about the minutia of the smaller things. I do have questions a little bit about the Deer Hill field, because that's a lot of money. That's half of this budget. And I don't necessarily understand if the difference of let's say this, I think there could be more information out there about why it is different. It's a good, nice field now. I just ran around with my son during one of the rec days. It's a beautiful field. It's in really good condition. It's right there. We use it all the time. So if I'm looking at this from a money standpoint, well, if we're going to tear that field up and go spend 1.8 on that field, what exactly are we getting? Are we getting 20 square feet more? Are we getting, obviously we've got lighting here, we've got a diamond, but I think that's a price tag which is so high, it warrants us to really ask, and the public is going to ask, and we should be prepared to have our votes reflect the questions we've asked. Is the 1.8 getting us $1.8 million worth of improvements on that spot? And that may be the case, but I think all the other things have been talked about a lot. I don't see as much focus on the Deer Hill side. That's just from my perspective.
I agree with you, Corey, on that, on the way you've framed that question. Are we getting $1.8 million worth of improvement and benefit?
I think the other question that's buried in there, I mean, I think Corey's point's spot on. It's cost benefit. I'm also struggling to understand how we spend $1.8 million, resurfacing of, what is fundamentally a flat field. Now, I do believe that they're going to go slightly deeper into the woods. The tree removal is not a big ticket item. There'll probably be some grading that needs to be done. But this is a big number fundamentally for, what is in effect the resurfacing of an already flat site and the addition of lights. So I mean, maybe we need to look at the bid, the bid specs when this comes back to understand what's driving this price. But this is a huge, it just feels like a big number.
Are we more or less in agreement that the tennis courts is not problematic at this time, based on what we know?
If
Does
you just
anyone have
walk
any reservations?
if you walk to the tennis courts, they're 10 years beyond their useful life. There's giant. I mean,
agree.
this should have been done, 8 years ago. So
and it comes up, it's come up perennially. Correct.
Yeah, my biggest question on the tennis courts is whether or not this work is actually going to fix the problem, which is they're built into the side of the hill and they're just going to continue to settle over time. And hopefully this retaining wall is a better fix. But are we really fixing this, or are we throwing good money after bad by continuing with that site?
So really fix the what problems? The court integrity.
My understanding is that there's a settling issue.
Right.
I haven't spent time there. Maybe others have been on that court and can actually speak intelligently on the matter. But my understanding is it's shifted around quite a bit.
Well, when was that court built? I mean, we'll have that problem almost regardless of where you put the tennis courts, right? I mean, the earth moves. So if these were built 30 years ago,
more than 30, I can tell you.
You could have put these on bedrock in New York City. You would have had to redo them at this point.
Yeah.
So,
okay. But Michael, your recollection is these are that site is more than 30 years old. These may have been resurfaced, but never.
We moved to town 30 years ago, and they were there. Right.
Okay. And Ralph, you play tennis. You've spent time on these courts, I take it.
Yeah, probably. I played on them 50 years ago, and they haven't changed. They haven't changed since then. They were cracked then, and they're cracked now.
So why fix them? No, kidding.
Builds character.
Okay.
Ralph,
what I've captured
one
here
person that spent a lot of time there. What are your thoughts about this project?
I do think it's a problematic site. Okay, because the land drops off rather steeply on one side, and you have to have a retaining wall in front of Milliken Field. So that's what the problem is there. I'm not convinced that you couldn't put a retaining wall on the downside and make it successful. I do think, as Corey said, that all these things will eventually crack in time. So I think I'm not opposed to that site. It's not a wonderful site, to be honest with you. It's shaded in an odd way. And it is odd to be down in a kind of a pit playing tennis. Most of us don't like that because it's hot. I'm serious about that. So it would be better if we could find a site where, in fact, you could put 6 courts that were much more in the open space rather than down in that area. But I'm not advocating for it because I don't know where to put it. But I would do that. If I were actually figuring it out, I would say this ought to be considered as to be a not desirable place for a number of reasons, okay? Especially the darkness down in there, and also the fact that you just don't get air. So I think that's how I'd look at it. Most courts are not built in those kinds of places. There are some. Hingham tennis courts, that is not the public ones, but the private ones are built down into a low well, and it's hotter than Hades in that area. And even though those are clay courts, and I think the Quincy ones are also there's the ones that we actually do tournaments in are also the same. It's undesirable to be down in a pit, to be honest with you. So.
Yeah. I can't really speak to location matter, but it is my understanding that they looked really pretty extensively throughout town to try and find a better spot. And came back to this. I don't know what that journey entailed and where they looked, but it kept coming back to this.
There were no quick fixes, Brian. I mean, from my previous 3 years looking at this and seeing and asking questions behind the scenes and with other people involved, the price tags kept going up just to get a site ready, right? I mean, or to purchase a site. To your point, there's nothing that's flat and ready and not already programmed throughout town. So. But we could talk about this for another 30 years and still not have a solution.
Just a quick question, Corey, if you can answer it. Is the Beechwood ballpark used these days? I have not seen much activity there, and it has an enormous outfield. Is that proposed to be used? Do you know?
I'm not too familiar with the programming there, but from what I've been told, it's especially been used more extensively. I know CYBSA paid for a big refurbishment 3 or 4 years back. I think it's more in the rotation now than it might have historically been, but that's all I can really say. That's that.
Yeah, I can tell you that in the spring, varsity ball plays there.
Okay.
Where I've seen what I think is varsity ball playing there, just looking at the ages of the kids.
Okay.
I have not seen much beyond that, although I have not really gone by there, say, on a Saturday morning early.
I believe it's used for Special Olympic programs too. I don't remember. Ted has a program for, again, I want to say it's a Special Olympics program, but I'm not entirely sure. For baseball or softball. I forget.
Right.
And it also is used by CYBSA for what are the oldest kids called, Babe Ruth or something? Is that it? Yeah,
that might be a New York, New Jersey reference, but yeah.
yeah. I mean, maybe it's called Ted Williams here. I don't know, but it's the slightly older kids. I think it's used.
Yeah.
I mean, the field does have its challenges. It's kind of like Fenway Park, right? It's squeezed into a site, so you really can't play aluminum bat, big kids there, or you're going to hit home runs all the time. But it is used, to the best of my knowledge. And as Corey pointed out, the town accepted a gift from the CYBSA a few years ago to rehab the infield. So,
just out of curiosity, shouldn't we actually get a percentage usage, some definitive quantitative measure of the usage of that? Because in fact, that is an alternative for an awful lot of potential uses. We really ought to have a quantitative number on this one.
So percentage usage, say, each month during spring, summer, fall?
I think that sounds good, Mike. Yeah, right.
So while it's not in this proposal, we were talking about getting these temporary pickleball courts that could be relocated to various places. They're not that expensive. But that's not in the plan at the moment. But if there was interest, that's something that we'd batted that around. So, but it's not in the plan right now.
And Chris, just to Ralph's earlier question, I remember in the document we got back from the Fields and Courts assessment, that gave all those numbers in really, really detailed spreadsheet format. So if you can drag that up, send it around, is that still around?
Yeah. That is all. Again, the point you're asking question to make sure we pull this stuff out, right? So I'm sure stuff on usage exists. I don't.
No. I remember it being there, but I also remember, I think, for the purposes of the Deer Hill discussion, the big gap that they had in programming in space was rectangular fields. That was we were underfielded by a worrying amount of them.
12 fields or 14 fields or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
When you light a field, you get the equivalent of, I think, 3 because of the amount of time you get theory.
It was a good piece of work, so I'm sure everyone.
Yeah, that's all there. Right. Again, these are the kinds of questions that's helpful to make sure we have very accessible on an FAQ. Or if nothing else, with links to more data, people really want to deep dive.
Okay, so we have a number of detailed questions here to follow up everything from trees to programming. I guess the big question that I think we need to get back to ultimately is, assuming that we press this from every different direction, and this number is real, including 1.8 for Deer Hill, the lighted fields, and we've got a $4 million ask here, and let's just say CPC doesn't want to do the whole thing. Let's just pick a round number. So they want to do half, 2 million. How do people feel about dealing with the other 2 million? Recognizing Corey's point that these are desires and not needs. I mean, there are a number of different choices. We can simply say, well, pick your 2 million in priorities and fund those through CPC and cut the programming, right? Or cut the project. That's one choice. A second choice, would be to, present the remaining 2 million to the taxpayers. It's something that they, at their discretion, can, elect to either fund or not fund through a tax increase. The third alternative is to, is to attempt to fund some part of this through the, through capital budget. It certainly won't cover the whole 2 million, but it could cover, a piece or two of this, a playground, a lacrosse wall, whatever. There's always the discussion of, whether or not the capital budget takes on debt to fund a project. So while I'm not suggesting that, I put that out as another alternative that, we should probably quickly discuss. So with, those sort of 5 alternatives out there, what are people's thoughts?
Just on your last point, Brian, I'm not allergic to capital taking on debt, but probably not for recreational purposes. I do think that's a public sphere, and that's one of the questions about CPC is I feel like for recreational purposes, there's a higher bar to cross. So I'd almost instinctively, as a policy, prefer that to have people vote versus putting it kind of in a fund or kind of burying it in somewhere else where then it runs into, for lack of a better term, less attractive capital projects. You don't want something right. That's recreation to get in the way of buying a snowplow, for lack of a better term.
Corey, you've instinctively jumped to item number 5, which again I put it was last on my list for a reason, instinctively as well. Perhaps we start there because it's probably the easiest to perhaps gain common ground. Does anyone on this call think it's a good idea to borrow against future capital appropriations in order to fund recreational projects, these recreational projects specifically? Or would we default to the other alternatives before that came to bear?
I don't think you can dismiss out of hand a request for recreation, since that is part of the quality of life that a town offers. Mm-hmm. And that's what we as a capital budget committee wrestle with all the time. We don't want to just say we'll never fund recreation. They do deserve something. And it's our job to try and balance the different pressures. And that's why we have discussions like, well, do we really need lighting? Do we really need a lacrosse wall? Do we really need to replace structures so that we can save money? Reserve money. Save's not a good word, but can we reserve money for to make as many projects viable as we can that the town either wants because it's quality of life or needs because infrastructure has failed. So I'm inclined to give recreation their due and seriously consider what they're asking for. I just want to make sure that someone's got to go back on the actual needs.
But Mike, more specifically, I think, and Brian, if I understood your phrasing correctly, it seemed pretty narrow, where we're talking about borrowing against capital budget funds for these purposes. I'm certainly capital being used for recreation is, to your point exactly, is necessary. But if it's a big project where there will be a debt service, long-term debt service, that's where I think these projects are better left to the public, because they are almost by definition, if they get to the point where it's a debt service thing, and these questions are, I do think they get into the wants category. I'm not saying they're bad or wants are a bad thing. So Brian, if I understood your question, we're talking about debt within the capital budget, not excluded debt, not CPC debt. We're narrowly talking about that. Did I understand you correctly?
That's correct. Number 5 on the list was, specifically borrowing in levy and paying out of future capital appropriations to make this happen. Whereas number 2 was, simply take it to the public and let them vote as to whether or not they want to fund it with a new tax. And so, there was a separate item for simply saying no.
Well,
That
and you made a gradient, right? That's kind of what you did with the 1 through 5. And I think 2
Yeah.
is a different question for us where, we need to be sure that the projects are not, the town's not getting robbed and they're not, gilded. But I think there's a different threshold for number 2 than number 5.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's why you phrase it as such. So number 2, the threshold that I have is much lower because it's going to the public. And whether we think, as long as this is not seriously misthought or seriously over budget or seriously misunderstood, I'm comfortable kind of taking more of a backseat if it's a number 2 type of question.
Now, I was literally thinking out loud, not jotting this down. Did anyone actually catch my 5 points? I'm trying to reach.
I'm trying to go back to them. So the first one was, will CPC cover any amount? The second one that Corey just mentioned is, do we punt the question to the STM with no recommendation?
Well, we make a recommendation, but it would be a recommendation to either for or against the public voting for a special tax to cover this.
Correct. Well phrased.
Okay.
It would call it a special purpose tax. I don't want to, I don't want to get into debate as to what comprises an override. Just call it a special purpose tax, whether that be, excluded debt or a one-time, a one-time capital expenditure and funded by taxpayers, whatever you want to call it. There's several ways to structure it.
Okay. So that's 2. What's 3?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to reconstruct in my head. Seems illogical when I rattled it off the first time.
It was probably CPC cover all, CPC cover partial, CPC cover none, full debt.
No, the whole thing was all 5 were under the context of CPC underfund. Just assuming if the CPC funds all of it, great. This is really a question of how do people feel about the different alternatives if CPC does not cover all of it. And we can, and I just picked a random number, say we're willing to pay 2 of 4, but it could be 3 of 4, whatever. They leave a gap, a substantial gap. How do people think about the different ways to
Right.
deal with that? One is to simply cut pieces of this program, and whatever CPC funds, that's what gets built, right? And then they prioritize among this group, and and fund to the CPC limit. The second one, the second alternative that I suggested was, we can take the balance to the public and let them decide whether or not they want to pay it through purposes, through a special purpose tax.
And then commit future capital stabilization funds to the project.
No, that's not number 2. That's a separate matter.
No, I'm sorry. That's a separate one that I.
Yeah, 3. Well, we don't have $2 million to spend on this. That's a bad example, but 3 would be, capital could certainly pitch in some portion of it, right?
Yeah. So I have as a bullet, commit future capital stabilization funds to this project.
Yeah, you're right. I think that was 3. I don't remember what 4 was, but 5 was, actually bonding, in levy against, as capital debt.
That was 5.
Remainder. Yeah.
But isn't that special purpose tax, or is that different?
No, it's different.
Yeah, within levy. I really haven't seen a conversation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
We're in 3 for 5, Brian, right? I think that's the context of these conversations have been CPC and, overrides, exclusions. You talk about this more, but it doesn't seem like 3 to 5 are really on the table for this.
That's fair, Corey. I haven't heard those socialized, and hopefully it stays that way. But how do people feel about the second alternative, which is a special purpose tax on this to cover whatever CPC does not cover?
Well, in general,
fundamentally, you're putting it to the taxpayer to make a decision. So
they're going to make that decision in several of these options. Anyway. So.
But in slightly different ways, though, Mike, right? So if we do a special, going to the ballot box versus just voting for a subline of an article, I think while it is a mechanism, they're fundamentally different, I guess, as people interact with them, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, so it's I understand the difference between the different bullets here. That this bullet we're discussing here, special purpose tax, is an add-on to our current tax rate. The next bullet is to bond the project within the current tax rate, which reduces the amount of money available for other operating expenses and so on.
Yeah, and to Corey's point, perhaps I'm overcomplicating it. No one's asked us to contemplate that, so perhaps it's just best we not.
It's what? It's what?
Perhaps it's just simply best we not contemplate it.
Bonding in the current tax levy.
Yeah.
Okay, so take that off our list.
Unless someone here believes that's a good idea.
I don't.
Ralph?
Listen, one is where we're speculating on something too early. I'm not sure the conversation needs to be concluded, right? So I'm perfectly happy to wait to see what, in fact,
what CPC comes back with
does. I mean, I don't want to speculate right now. What can you? You can't do it.
But you know what's useful is the fact that we've actually articulated our options more formally than we ever have.
Okay.
And so we sort of keep that up on our whiteboard here, saying, these are the different ways we can pay for things. Let's choose one of them. Let's be mindful.
Those are broadly applicable to all of these projects. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
That's right.
Okay.
So Ralph, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and hope that you're the winner on the CPC conversation. Okay. Is there anything else on Fields and Courts?
The only one I would throw in is this lacrosse wall. If someone is going to, I think, describe how that will not be a less than aesthetic addition to what already is a crowded field associated with the recreation area. I think we have talked about that before, but a concrete wall down there, in my view, is something one will have to consider as to whether or not aesthetic. Well, one, is it really, really needed? We had many conversations with people whose children were in lacrosse and said they don't need it, and others who said they did. But on the other hand, are we okay with a concrete wall in that site for that sole purpose? So that's the question.
So
let me also highlight the question of lighting at Deer Hill School. And the question I would ask is, based on the experience of the baseball fields with their lighting, what has been the result? Are there more games now scheduled at Barnes Field and adjacent fields? Is there a lift from the lighting? And is it worth the amount of money that the lighting will cost? So that's just a question. I'm not looking for an answer here, but I would put that in our list of questions.
I'm not overly concerned about kind of the policy or whether the neighbors will like all that stuff from this seat here, but I am curious about, again, if this is we're letting the public is going to vote on this. I think the questions we can ask is, what are the long-term implications for operating budgets, maintenance, right? Is this something where we're buying something that it seems like with tennis courts, we save a lot of money, or we don't save money, but there's long-term benefits as time goes on. If we're adding lights, is this another $20,000 a year of facilities? I doubt it is. I'm being hyperbolic here, but those are I think for my seat where I am, those are the questions. Yeah, if we do this, what kind of expenses are we going to do? Because all those expenses will have to come out of the in-levy budget, right? So if there's stuff and that's from my seat where I'm projecting, I'm worried about, not worried, I'm going to ask about is just long-term implications to maintenance and cost.
And Corey, you have found for yourself the key question that we on capital budget often ask is, what is the total cost of ownership on any of our purchases?
Of course.
And we really delve deeply into that. So this is great that, you know, you discovered this on your own, but
do this every day.
yeah. Right. So I've captured that.
Okay, so we moved on to the next item.
Sure.
Please.
Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, that's roads and sidewalks. Is that correct on the agenda?
I closed my tab. My apologies.
Okay.
Yes, it's roads and sidewalks.
Okay. Can I interject here? We've got an
Please.
hour left.
Yep.
What drove me to request this meeting was really the desire to compare notes on what we heard on the executive sessions.
Okay.
So the question I asked the group is, how much time do we want to set aside to make sure we get through all that?
I think we'll get through the other things pretty quickly. I think we'll get there, Mike.
Okay.
If we got a 610 for exec, you know, the other things we have been batted around by this committee and by other committees quite a bit. So
yeah.
Let's just jump into it and see where we end up.
Okay.
If we find ourselves 10 minutes over, we can just lit it.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Before we do go into executive session, let me just make one comment. I think roads and sidewalks is pretty straightforward. With regards to the school maintenance fund, I think the key there is that, you know, we're very shortly going to need to see the list
Yes.
of anticipated maintenance items and upgrades that would take place as maintenance items get dealt with, so that we can get some comfort that, you know, that a flow of $1.5 million per year feels to be about the right number, and that they can constructively deploy that and start to, you know, work through a punch list at those schools to resolve these issues. You know, right now this is just a number and a concept, and the AI3 study has been done now for, you know, for over a year. There's a list in there that, you know, that goes far beyond items that actually need to be addressed, and it includes sort of every item that would be done differently today based on today's codes if we were building a new building. And obviously, you know, things that are grandfathered and not necessarily a hazard don't necessarily need to be brought up to code. So, you know, there is a lot of work to boil down this list and get to a real action plan. And my understanding is that that's taking place, but I haven't seen it. I think we're going to need to see it. We're going to need a meeting to go through it. But apart from that, I'm not really sure there's much more to say on schools or roads or sidewalks.
Just
Chris,
to hop back. Sorry, Mike, go ahead, please.
I was going to ask Chris, do you have any intel, any info on what the structure would be? So 1.5 million per year for how many years? What's the mechanism? Is it a override? What can you tell us?
So these the fund is initially voted like an exclusion by the voters, and then its future is determined by the select board in the sense that it can increase it every year by as much as 2.5%. It can decrease it, but that becomes a new ceiling, and then at some point it can say we don't need this anymore and get rid of it. So it's not a permanent. It doesn't have a. It's not a permanent exclusion like an override, nor is it a timed exclusion like a bond, right? If you borrow for 20 years, you borrow for 20 years, then when you pay, it's gone. So a fund like this could last for many years if the town wanted to. There's an ongoing conversation about adopting a policy to govern it like we have with other financial policies. how it would be managed. Because, that happened with the special ed stabilization fund, for example, as a policy rather gets done. A policy is in development now for this fund as well. And in terms of conversations, Nick Berardi, the director of facilities, has been in long conversations with Pat Sullivan, the superintendent, and his team, and there's been and the school facilities committee and a select board liaison. So there's been a lot of conversations going on to try and get a list that's updated. It's the IA3 list is a key part of it, but it's not the part of it, right? Nick has looked at it and moved some stuff up and moved some stuff down and recommend some stuff that go on, and schools are doing the same thing. So that's in a place now where I think the school committee is going to be giving a green light to something fairly soon. So that'll be out there. And again, like all these lists, really the first year or two are the ones that are more locked. You can always move things around as things change going out forward, but there's going to be enough real projects there, I think, to show a number of years worth of, real spend. And including, I'm not telling you anything that hasn't been discussed already. There's just the Deer Hill and Osgood roofs are going to have to be replaced in the next 5 years, right? So 5-6 years. So maybe less than that. So those are just two of very large projects that are coming down the pike. And this would, I think the conversation has been, the high level conversation has been about having this for like that kind of stuff, right? Not to buy new chairs necessarily, right, for a classroom, but to really invest in the heavy duty stuff. It's not just roofs, by the way. There's other things that are really big too. Maybe replacing bathrooms or something big that's expensive and time consuming, or right. You're doing some electrical upgrades or something, right, or something with the HVAC system. It's that kind of stuff that we're talking about. Is that helpful?
Very, yeah. Thank you.
So the bottom line is this continues until there's a decision for it to no longer continue. Is that accurate? And does it default to a 2.5% growth, or does it?
No,
or is it flat unless you vote an increase?
Correct. The select board, once it's voted. So I'm sorry. I also added. I forgot to add the other caveat. Right, it has to be spent through town meeting. So it would, the spend would go through the regular process, right? You still have to go through the reviews and at the end of the day, town meeting still has to vote for spending because it's a special fund. The select board, however, has the control over whether to increase the fund. And that's a max of 2.5%. They don't have to increase it, but they can up to 2.5% a year. And they also have the exclusive ability to reduce it, though again, I believe they're going to want to have a public conversation about this. They're not going to do it in a vacuum. And so it can be reduced. And so and again, as I said, though, the actual spend of the fund has to go through the regular process, which means capital projects will still get reviewed by this committee and others, and then town meeting still has to vote to fund them.
Okay.
Let me ask
so this is just a mechanism to get the money in, to raise the money and put it into the fund, and then there will be.
Let me ask a question, if I may. This sounds like just simply a bypassing of Prop 2.5, unless I misunderstand this, and that anybody who makes an assertion that in fact you're going to continue a tax which exceeds Prop 2.5 on a regular basis is going to say this is kind of a workaround to avoid, in fact, a current law in Massachusetts. So you're going to have to explain why, in fact, you would in fact allow yourselves to grant a stabilization fund, which in fact on a continuous basis would exceed Prop 2.5, when in fact it is a significant departure from all of our previous experience, where in fact we had a major HVAC system or a roof or any other major expense. We paid for that expense with a specific appropriation. This is not a specific appropriation. This is just a new tax with the discretion to use it for specific purposes, but broadly defined. Very dangerous, and I would certainly say you have to explain this in much better terms and tell us why you're not surreptitiously, quite frankly, avoiding meeting the law, which calls for no more than a 2.5% tax increase unless specifically done for projects. So I think this is a really serious issue that has to be reconsidered. And stabilization fund sounds good, but maybe you have to rethink how people will really look at this.
So this is actually new to me. That said, it is a provision in law. It's in the law, and whether there's a public vote required, there is actually a ballot box vote required to set it up. So the select board doesn't get to set it up by itself. The select town meeting has to create it, but then if it's going to be funded in an override capacity, right, or beyond 2.5, it has to have a public vote. There's only one vote needed, though, just like a debt exclusion. You only need one, or any kind of exclusion. You need one vote. So the public does have to support it, public at the ballot box, and then that vote allows it. It does have a little bit different time, as you point. Typically, a tax override is forever, right? It goes in, is in forever, unless there's a vote to voters can also lower the tax override. It doesn't happen a lot, but you could do that. Debt exclusions are timed. The only difference between this and a debt exclusion is that it's for debt, it's for projects, but it's not timed in the same sense. But it does require a vote. Though, again, this is new to me too. I think a lot of information has to be put out there. And there's a number of communities who are using this. It's not used as commonly, but there's a number of communities that are using this to catch up with projects. Some communities on the Cape have done that, and we most certainly have to share, I think, links to other communities that have done that, just to show what people have done.
So just a couple of thoughts, Ralph, and this may or may not be helpful or even relevant, but I just share a couple of observations. This is a tax mechanism to raise funds. In terms of spending it's not a bypass. You still have to come back to town meeting and vote individual items in terms of approving the spend from this, from this new revenue source. Some people do default to calling this a stabilization fund. A fund is just an account. The reality of this is that it's a special purpose tax. Funds don't fund themselves, right? So the way I think about this is that it is an override.
Yeah.
From a taxpayer's perspective, from a governance perspective, there's zero ability for this to get redirected from its intended purpose in the future, because it is absolutely specific in terms of what it can be used for. So if we just do, a general override, for $1.5 million, there's no guarantee that that's going to go to the school year after year after year after year, right? Or maybe it goes to school, but it doesn't go into the school facilities. It gets sucked into the operating budget, which is the constant pressure, in the allocation of funds between operating and capital. So by setting this up as a discrete special purpose tax, and let's just call it what it is. It's fundamentally an override. It can only be used as intended, which is to fund the facilities of the schools. And the same is true for the other tax, which is roads and sidewalks. Nobody can neglect roads and sidewalks and vacuum that money out and, pay overtime or heavens knows what else in the operating budget. It can only be spent on roads and sidewalks on the other fund, which is for roads and sidewalks. So yes, override, but not so much of a bypass, so much as it is, sort of a lockdown in terms of making sure those funds hit their intended purpose, which is capital spend.
And I think to Ralph's point and to your point, Brian, and I brought this up when I was still on the board a few months back, we have two discussions happening, right, in parallel, right? One is the needs, but the other is the mechanism. And I expressed in the select board, I don't want the needs to get swallowed up by the mechanism, right? If there are needs, and I said this publicly before, maybe we just do a one-time fund. If there's X, Y, Z of stuff we need to do, make the argument, let's do it. But I don't want us to get caught in misunderstanding of this mechanism. I also see it similar to how Brian expressed it, which is I look, instead of kind of bottom up, I look top down, which is an override would get lost in the general fund. It gets swallowed up by union negotiations. Everyone would know we'd have all this money. But this is an override that has a clear sunset provision, doesn't require us to go to a vote to undo it, and can't be touched by other things. So it's an override that gives the people a lot of control over making sure it doesn't get out of hand, it doesn't get lost. And again, if this is really unpopular, it can get sunset next year, right? I mean, if someone runs on a platform that says I don't support the $1.5 million, I want to end this, and they get elected, the select board can there's no other. It sunsets automatically unless you use it. So I think it's the. But back to the original point, which is it's still so misunderstood that I think this committee needs a clear presentation from Chris or the finance director, whoever it is, about exactly the details of this. And the public needs it too, because I don't want us to be stuck talking about why and not talking about the needs. I think that's where we get in trouble with not being able to determine exactly what the best path forward is. If that made any sense.
Rob, did that help at all?
Let me give you a very specific example of what I consider to be the simplest example to describe why people are going to have a difficulty with this. I'm going to talk about roads. Okay. What we know is that we have roughly 40 miles of roads, 38 miles of roads. We know that every 20 years we need to actually rebuild those roads. And we talk about 2 miles of roads a year. So in that way, we actually get through this whole thing. What does it cost to do 2 miles of roads? It costs you $500,000 per mile or $1 million a year. So in fact, if in fact this is done in some form, whether it is a stabilization or whatever you want to call it, you're avoiding the obvious problem, which is that you're not paying for what is an obvious need and which has continuous need indefinitely. So that's only one example of maybe what is wrong with this kind of a stabilization fund, is we are not funding capital as we should within the operating budget. And yet you have to fund the capital specifically for roads, as we always had done in the past, but no longer do it. So you're going to have to answer that question, because in fact that says this is a permanent long-term increase in taxation and exceeding Prop 2.5, and it applies to whatever other stabilization applications are actually in that final.
To be blunt, I view this as permanent. I think anyone that talks about this, being optional is not really thinking ahead. This is permanent. The roads are never going to go away, and frankly, the maintenance on the school buildings is never going to go away. We had a period with the school buildings where we didn't have major maintenance spend because we had 3 building projects that were relatively fresh, right? But now they're all in their 3rd decade of life, and that honeymoon's over.
Ralph, how would you frame a question on your concern that I can put into our notes here?
Yeah, I think the question is, how does this avoid being just simply an override, a permanent override for Prop 2.5? How does this avoid being a permanent? And I don't want to hear just, well, we can vote to terminate it. I mean, that's not an adequate answer, because that you can't terminate road construction. So the question is, how are you going to actually see this? How are people going to see this as not a permanent override? Or are you saying this is a permanent override?
I think it is.
It is an override.
I don't know if other people are seeing it differently, but I think it is. The roads don't ever go away. The buildings don't ever go away. But
you could see a scenario, Brian, where if there is a school project coming up, there is a horse trade, right? Listen, you don't need $1.5 million anymore because we're going to put this in a project that's now excluded. And that $1.5 million is going to come out of the budget and now limit the impact of the taxpayer. So you could see a horse trade down the road with one of these funds.
Corey's point is accurate. I mean, we've got multiple school buildings. If we scraped one and replaced it, or did a full renovation on one of the buildings, you would see a dip in annual maintenance for the first probably 20 years post project for that one building, but the other 2 would continue. So there could be a scenario where the 1.5 is more than we need if in fact you did something else more major. But I think in simplest terms, people should consider these permanent. I don't know if others are seeing it differently. I'd be very curious if other people on this call see this as anything less than permanent. I see it as permanent. I mean, structurally, there's the option to make it not permanent, but in terms of the need, I see the need as permanent.
I would, on the roads and sidewalks, I see it as permanent because I mean, kind of to tee off what Ralph brought up, is we've seen the encroachment of the roads and sidewalk budget increasingly taking up capital. This is no longer sustainable, right? This is just, we have a year and a half, 2 years left before basically we have to make a choice, either do an override, don't pave roads, or don't do anything else. I mean, that's just coming down the tracks. On the school side, there's big conversations happening. And the argument for this fund has been, we have this list of repairs and maintenance that hasn't been done, and we're behind, we have to catch up. That's been the argument. So for me, I have an expectation that you will have to show what every year, what the things, how you're doing on that catch-up list. And if there's something drastic changes, I expect the catch-up list to go away. I think that even in this committee, if we talk about supporting any of these, having a very clear, we want to see this sunset in 5 years, or we want to see, I mean, we can have that expectation set up. And I don't think we're barred from making that, because there will be a time where we can vote against the continuous spending of this fund. We can do that.
I'd like to offer some thoughts. We the town, seem to be facing a generational convergence of building needs. Town hall, public safety, roads, and schools. And the town has, to my knowledge, never really done good future planning for known big money projects, big money buildings coming up. We may be skating our way through a difficult stretch by if we do, and this will bring us to our next topic, but if we are able to secure a new town hall, a new police or public safety building for shorter money than we hoped, than we feared, I should say, not hope. Great. But schools we have talked about for several years anyway, that I've been on either advisory or capital budget, knowing that school roofs was almost just a meme for ongoing school maintenance. Every year we get hit with, well, we need to replace all the tiles. We need to replace windows. We need to replace a brick wall that's failing. I see this fund as a good way forward to set money aside for these known future expenses. And it may be that we've got to ante up, something I don't want to do on a fixed income personally, but it seems to me that this town has to face that. So I would, recognizing that it's probably a good solution, then the question is how do we implement it in a way that is smart and has legs, smart and can carry us forward in a reliable way that isn't subject to, I'll use the term gaming the system. So that's my thought on this at this point. It seems that our finance director has come up with a way for us to set money aside for what we know is going to be big ticket.
Can I put a pin question, right? Just wrap that up, Mike, before we move on, which is, if these funds exist, does capital budget have an advisory authority on those going forward? Or are they once we pass them, are they select board only, or what is the role of capital budget on these funds going forward? I think that's a governance question we should have the answer to.
Okay.
I agree with you, Corey, and this should be no different than any other capital item. These are funds set aside for specific capital projects to be identified in the future, and when they're identified, the ability to spend should follow the regular way capital process.
I just want to be sure the law isn't written in a way that
it
Or at least we can pass the funds with the simulator.
The governance absolutely needs to continue.
You realize, I want to say something though. You realize that a year ago, before you heard of doing this stabilization fund, we talked very seriously about how come capital is underfunded year after year after year. And yet we have never, now we're saying it is underfunded, but we're not going to ask the town to take a sharper pencil to its budget. We're going to just take it to the taxpayers to pay for it.
Correct.
So that is a shift in our philosophy. Rightly or wrongly, be aware of how different that sounds. It will sound to a lot of people. So
I agree with you, Ralph, and I think some people may have something to say about it.
Yeah.
The choice has always existed to make room for capital out of the operating budget, and taxpayers certainly have the right to voice their opinion on that matter.
Brian, is there any progress from the long-range planning group for upping the funding to capital budget to dole out?
I would tell you I've seen no movement in that direction.
That's really disappointing.
At a bare minimum, I view it as an absolute requisite to support the entire package, to at least fix the funding mechanism so that it grows and doesn't remain flat, and it needs to be systematic so that it's not negotiated every year. Otherwise it's just going to create another massive funding shortfall, like the one we're dealing with right now. But I mean, the reason we're here is a confluence of two events. One is the funding mechanism didn't grow for the past 13 years. And, we've certainly tried to backfill that with STM appropriations out of free cash in more recent years. But the second issue is that when the mechanism was set in the first place, no one anticipated the magnitude of needs, or for that matter, any needs, for us to be spending, the way we are today required to spend on IT, which was non-existent at that point as a spend item, roads, which, back in 2009 was non-existent as a spending item. We just spent what the state gave us.
Yep.
And our buildings, which, with the exception of, well, I shouldn't say with the exception, in the case of the school buildings, we're all relatively fresh at that point and had no anticipated, major maintenance requirements for the foreseeable future. But, that's 13 years ago.
Yep.
I've phrased the question as, are we allowing the operating budget to ignore or shortchange capital projects by going to the taxpayer for special tax levies? Special
yes,
taxes.
I think the blunt answer is yes, we are.
That's exactly what we're doing.
It's the right question, though. It's the right question.
Right.
It is, and I think people are going to ask it. I mean, the fact is we've grown the operating budgets, we've underfunded capital, and now we're fundamentally in front of the taxpayers with an override for capital. Right. It's not really for capital; it's to fund what we've done on the operating budgets.
All right, so I just spoke out in support of the special purpose stabilization fund, and I still rest on that. Yeah. But really, the only other option would be to go to Chris and say, you've got to cut operating expenses to allow for enough funds to be set aside for future capital projects. We'd have to go to Chris and say, you've got to give us $3 million a year. And you're going to have to find it somewhere else, just to be tough.
I mean, but to be blunt, Mike, that's kind of outside of this committee's authority. We can make recommendations, we can work within, but we have no control over Chris whatsoever. That's a select board, and it's the advisory committee who controls the operating budget. So the advisory committee has approved more firefighters, more police officers, more road paving, all these things, then we can look to that side of the aisle about why our operating budget is where it is. This committee, we don't have the power, nor, is it necessarily the town manager's sins for how the operating budget has grown, nor is it his job to correct. If advisory select board wants to take this on, they can, and maybe we should be more active in talking to them about doing that, because we see the freight train coming down the end of the tunnel, and it's a problem. But that's the lane we have here. And I don't want to be blunt about it, but that's where we sit.
Yeah,
it is. It's just the blunt truth.
All right.
But Ralph, Mike, I agree with you. I think there are going to be people in the audience that are going to say, why did you grow the operating budgets and not fund your capital needs? And that's a perfectly legitimate place to be.
We don't have to answer. That's not, every question has somebody should answer it. That's not us. So
I agree with that as well. I mean, it's a question for select board and advisory.
You mind if we lid this because we're 20 minutes over and move on to our exec?
I'm good.
Sure.
Okay, so we're gonna, at this point, do we have a motion to move to executive session under the exemption for the acquisition of real estate?
So moved.
I have a second.
Second.
All right. We will do a roll call vote. Corey Evans.
Corey Evans, aye.
Ryan Host, aye. Ralph Dormitzer.
Dormitzer, aye.
Mike Dick.
Mike Dick, aye.
And Chris Senior's got his hand up.
Yeah, can you just, because we're still being recording here, could you actually just note that you're going to, unless you're going to come back in a public session, are you going to come back in a public session?
We will not come back in public session unless someone tells me we're required to, which I believe.
No, you're not. So you'll adjourn from executive session, not return to public session.
Yeah. So just to Chris's point, to anyone in the public that's watching, we will now adjourn to executive session. We will not be returning to public session after that discussion.
And Chris, you're going to breakout room us? Is that how